Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. If I sound a little hoarse and if I make frequent stops during this video, I apologize. Dealing with some kind of a slight illness that I just can't seem to shake at the moment. But we're going to dive into some more American history today with the American Civil War. It's definitely one of my bread and butter topics, and we have covered the Overland Campaign a little bit here and there, but I'm in the process right now of writing a script for a podcast episode on the Battle of Cold Harbor, so I thought it'd be a great time to dive into that topic since we're right around the anniversary of that battle. And I will also mention during this video one of the other reasons I'm especially interested in the Overland Campaign right now, and it has to do with my next book. So be watching for that. If you haven't already had the opportunity to check out my recent book that just came out, which is the story of a company of soldiers from Ohio, that's relevant to my announcement later on. Then you can go to TrumbleCountyBoys.com or just go to Amazon and look for Trumbull County Boys, and you'll be able to see the book there. Let's dive into this one. We're going to be taking a look at History Gone Wilder, who does a lot of real deep dives into Civil War topics, especially battles of the Civil War. I'll put the link down in the description. He is at 74,000 subscribers. Would love to see us be able to push him just a little bit closer to that magic 100,000, which is a big deal for people making YouTube videos. You get that fun little thing that I've got right there behind me, the silver play button, which is just really validating to you as somebody who puts in a lot of work to content creation. I want to thank Calvin Marks the third, don't want to miss that third, who just signed up as one of our executive producer patrons a couple of months back. Thank you so much, Calvin, for your support. Your name shows up at the end of every video now. Let's dive into this one.
Page or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. With Union forces moving toward Cold Harbor, the battle lines for the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia began to shift. William Baldy Smith and his 18th Corps and Horatio Wright and his 6th Corps were on the far Union left. So
let's just give a little background here. First of all, Horatio Wright's in command of the 6th Corps because John Sedgwick was killed at Spotsylvania Courthouse. So Sedgwick has commanded the 6th Corps for a couple of years at this point. He's beloved by the men, and he's the highest-ranking Union soldier killed during the entire American Civil War. Wright, I think Wright's an adequate Corps commander, but he's not excellent, and Grant doesn't have a lot of patience for just adequate at this point. But back up a little bit for those who aren't familiar. This is the spring into summer campaign of 1864 that's happening in Virginia. These are the two main armies that most people focus on, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of the Potomac. There are other units involved. Grant is now the commander-in-chief of all Union forces, has been going back a couple of months at this point. He's accompanying this particular army in the field, but he's in command of all armies. And his whole focus is pressure on all fronts at the same time. So the Confederacy doesn't get a break. They can't shift units between fronts based on what's happening. And so this is all about relentless pressure on Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia.
Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade wanted to mount an offensive in the Cold Harbor area.
And the other thing that you can see right now that's happening is you've got Hill, Early, and Anderson. Where's Longstreet? Well, Longstreet was severely wounded at the Wilderness, friendly fire, which seems to be the way that high-ranking Confederate generals go down in many cases. So he's not here. So there's no Stonewall Jackson. There's no James Longstreet. You're dealing with the likes of A.P. Hill and Jubal Early and Robert Anderson. Not Robert Anderson. He was the guy in defense of Fort Sumter. Had to stop and reset. Richard Anderson. Let's continue.
So they wanted demonstrations made by the other Corps commanders to distract Lee and maybe relieve pressure that might be coming toward Wright and Smith. Governor K. Warren, commanding the 5th Corps, was ordered to demonstrate in his front, but he was unwilling to do so. So Meade called on Winfield Scott Hancock and the 2nd Corps to push in the enemy pickets. The assault plan for Wright and Smith's troops was scheduled for 6 p.m. on June 1st. Meade placed Wright in charge of the attack, even though Smith outranked him.
So there's a lot going on here. The Union has suffered, both sides have suffered tremendous casualties because you've had the Battle of the Wilderness, you had Spotsylvania Courthouse, you had the North Anna. You've just basically been seeing We think of in the past you have the battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, but you've got months in between these battles. So now imagine if you had Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg all in the span of about a month. That's what you're dealing with here. That's what these guys are facing. These guys have been bloodied and bloodied badly. And some of these units, especially some of the units in the Second Corps, have just seen complete turnover in their numbers because of the places they fought.
Wright didn't have experience in such large operations. 4 infantry divisions would be used to attack the Confederate flank, 20,000 blue-coated soldiers. The Confederates numbered around 10,000, but they were behind breastworks. Prior to the attack, Robert Hoke, fearing for the safety of his right flank, moved Hagood's brigade from the position on his left to his right flank.
So he mentions the breastworks there, and that's really one of the things that doesn't get, I think, talked about enough in 1864. A lot of people, especially it was a big part of the Lost Cause narrative, was that Grant was this butcher who just hurled his men against the Confederates and took all these tremendous casualties. First of all, it's important to note that Lee, over the course of the war, not just in percentage but in raw numbers, lost more men than Grant did. And Grant inflicted tremendous casualties on the enemy. Yes, did Grant lose a lot of casualties in this campaign? Absolutely. But he's also attacking an enemy that by 1864 is regularly entrenching every chance it gets. You're dealing with entrenchments in every one of these battles.
A wise move because the 6th Corps troops overlapped his flank, but he didn't notify any of his superiors about the movement, which resulted in a gap between his division and Kershaw's division. Instead of attacking as one mass, the Union brigades went in piecemeal. The division of David Russell went in first.
And this is so important in understanding this. I make no secret of the fact that I am a huge fan of Ulysses S. Grant, right? I mean, he's one of my all-time favorite Americans. He's one of my all-time favorite historical figures. And Grant himself would tell you that there were mistakes made at Cold Harbor. But I would contend, and it's not Grant only that I defend in this way. I make similar defenses of General Burnside at Fredericksburg. I would contend that the mistakes that were made at Cold Harbor were less at the top levels of command, Meade and Grant, and much more at the corps level, especially during the disastrous attack in early June. This is a failure to properly coordinate these forces.
William Penrose's New Jersey Brigade began the assault. The men from New Jersey were decimated by small arms fire and canister when they advanced. They couldn't withstand the shelling for long and fell back to the rear.
If you outnumber your opponent 2-1 and you're attacking with a couple of regiments at a time, what do you expect to happen?
Penrose wouldn't be outdone and formed up 2 more regiments to feed into the attack. They stepped off into the den of death and became pinned down about 50 yards from the Confederate works. The Union men dug feverishly to pile up any amount of dirt to protect themselves from the projectiles. Next, Nelson Cross's brigade, backed up by 2 regiments of Vermonters from Lewis Grant's brigade, attacked next. Just like Penrose's men, the attack ground to a halt as artillery shells, canister, and musketry ripped holes in their lines. Many of the men retreated in haste, while others attempted to remain on the front and dig small rifle pits to protect themselves. To the north, Emory Upton, the man who broke the Confederate line at the Muleshoe.
So Emory Upton at Spotsylvania Courthouse is the one who comes up with the strategy. He was a colonel at the time, comes up with the strategy that rather than attacking on a broad front with a massive force, you do kind of a prick strike where you kind of layer them, so you've got multiple layers of regiments, and then you just break through. It's kind of infiltration tactics. It's very similar to what you're going to see used by German stormtroopers during the First World War, and then you exploit the breach. He was promoted on the spot by General Grant to Brigadier General for this, and receives widespread acclaim for his innovative tactics.
Spotsylvania battlefield was forming his men for his own attack. Remembering how he did so well by stacking his regiments, he made 4 lines of men, about 500 men in each line. The first 3 were made up of the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. The last line was made up of the rest of his regiments.
And these heavy artillery units, it sounds like to someone who doesn't really study this deeply, you'd think, well, why are you attacking with artillery regiments? Well, these heavy artillery regiments, which are like 2,000 men, at a time when a brand new line infantry regiment is 1,000 men, but most regiments in the field are like 400 or 500 at this point. That's the big one. Some of them are much smaller than that, maybe 200 or 300. But these are units that were actually manning forts in places like Washington, D.C. And Grant pulls them all out of the forts and turns them into infantry. And so these are regiments that are basically the size of brigades.
As soon as they stepped off, flanking fire came in on their left. Hoke's division had cut down trees to funnel the men into a few locations, which allowed them to practice their musketry with devastating results.
Smart.
Upton ordered his men to lay down. Henry Eustis was ill and his brigade wasn't moving to support Upton's attack. Russell, angry at the lack of movement, took charge of the brigade and led it forward. The division commander received a nasty arm wound in the attack, and the rebel resistance proved too much for Eustis's brigade.
Yeah, you have to wonder if all of this had happened at once instead of here and there. And we see this on both sides. It happens regularly. I mean, Braxton Bragg does the same kind of stuff at Shiloh when he's attacking the Hornets' Nest. He's just throwing like a brigade at a time instead of using his numbers.
Which fell back to their stepping-off point. William Truex Brigade was the next Union brigade to begin their movement against the Confederate line. Fortunately for them, Hagood's movement created a gap in the Confederate line, and Truex's men occupied the abandoned works and went into the rear of the Confederate line.
There you go.
Wofford's attention was distracted by Benjamin Smith's approaching line, so Truex made it through the lines without much damage. However, once they were behind the Confederate lines, the 8th North Carolina turned to face them and delivered some deadly volleys into their ranks. Truex's men were undeterred by the rifle fire and sent it right back into the Tar Heels. The 8th broke, and the 51st North Carolina, the next ones in line, turned to face the threat.
Right. I mean, at this point, you're doing exactly what you want to do. Is if you're the Union, you're exploiting a breach. You're going to isolate this particular division over here, or maybe slightly more than a division, and you've got an opportunity to cut them off and destroy them piecemeal, and then turn and do the same on this side. Remember too that this is the old Gaines Mill battlefield from 1862. So 2 years earlier, there had been a major battle fought here, and a lot, especially of the Union soldiers, had been hastily buried in very shallow graves, and 2 years of weather have now uncovered a lot of those. And so a lot of the gruesome pictures that you see of a lot of African-American men out in the field collecting bones, there's photos that were taken in 1865. A lot of those are the bones of men who had died back in 62, and these guys are attacking over that ground.
By this time, Truex's men were in disarray, being behind the lines and getting fired at by Thomas Clingman's troops and a few soldiers from William Wofford's brigade. However, the tenacious Upton reformed his ranks and put pressure on Clingman's front, keeping the Confederate brigade commander from dispatching troops to his left. On the Union right, the divisions of Charles Devens and William Brooks of William Baldy Smith's 18th Corps advanced in a more coordinated effort against the Confederate line.
There you go.
The pressure against Wofford, Goodbrine, and Clingman caused the line to collapse as a direct result of the breakthrough where Hoke removed Hagood's brigade. A few rebels fired their weapons as they retreated from their positions, which slowed down the Union troops but didn't stop them. Alfred Colquitt sent the 28th and part of the 23rd and 27th Georgia to hit the Yankees in the left flank, while Joseph Kershaw pulled the 2nd South Carolina and the 3rd South Carolina Battalion from Hennigan's brigade and sent them to hit the blue troops in the right flank.
So now what you've got is Union soldiers attacking over difficult terrain. This is not exactly a wide open, clean field that's easy to march through. They've exhausted themselves breaking through the Confederate lines, and now you have a counterattack by fresh Confederate soldiers. And this is always a difficult thing for an attacker to withstand.
It was getting dark on that June 1st evening, and the darkness, along with the few regiments thrown onto the flanks of the Union soldiers in the breakthrough, caused the blue troops to move back to their original battle lines. Darkness had saved Robert E. Lee's army from disaster. The attacks on the Confederate right looked promising to Grant and Meade, so they wanted to shift more troops into that sector in order to break Lee's lines and have a road all the way to Richmond.
This is all perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. When you think about the situation as it now exists, you've had some success. You're going to send some reinforcements because you've got the big manpower advantage. This all makes total sense in light of what's happened so far.
Grant pulled the 2nd Corps out of its entrenchments and ordered it to the left of the line. He wanted Winfield Scott Hancock and the 2nd Corps to be ready to support a 6 a.m. assault in that sector by Wright and Smith.
Now, the Second Corps has already been heavily engaged in this campaign. These are a lot of veterans, but there's also a lot of new troops in here as well to kind of fill the gaps, because the Second Corps has taken so many casualties over the last couple of years of fighting that they've just been decimated repeatedly, and that's why you don't see some of the corps that you're used to seeing in the Eastern Theater. You know, back at Gettysburg, you had the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 11th, and 12th Corps. You don't see all of those numbers now because some of those corps have been merged into other corps, and some of those regiments and divisions and brigades have all been reworked because they've taken so many casualties.
Lee saw that Hancock was now gone and pulled part of A.P. Hill's corps away from the left and moved them to the Confederate right.
So here's the problem now, is that Grant has shifted the men over, but now that frees up the Confederates to do the exact same thing.
Left Henry Heath's division of Hill's corps on the left. In addition to Hancock moving to the Union left, Ambrose Burnside and his 9th Corps moved behind Warren's 5th Corps. When Smith informed Grant and Meade that he was in need of ammunition, the 6 a.m. attack was delayed until 5 p.m. on June 2nd, but it would ultimately be delayed again until the morning of June 3rd. While the Union Army was shifting, Lee wanted to take advantage of the situation. He saw
So one thing you can't give Robert E. Lee in this situation is time. You know, if this is all about pressure and it's all about exploiting opportunities, then every minute you allow him is a minute he has to strengthen his defenses, to improve his situation.
Opportunity to deal a blow to Grant when Burnside removed his corps. However, not all of Burnside's corps had gone from the Union right. Lee wanted Jubal Early to fall on the Union right flank and cause as much damage as possible. Early's troops again headed for the area around the Bethesda Church, where the division of Thomas Crittenden and Charles Griffin were stationed. Robert Rhodes' division hit the Union brigades first, with 2 brigades from Crittenden's division occupying the Shady Grove Road. The 2 Union brigades attempted to hold out, but for an unknown reason, Joseph Sudsberg's brigade advanced toward the rebel division. The blue-coated soldiers were heavily outnumbered, and the musketry ripped their line to shreds, sending them and Elisha Marshall back toward the church. Henry Heath's division was advancing around the same time as Rhodes was pushing away Sudsberg and Marshall. It was getting late in the evening, and the stiff resistance put up by Simon Griffin's brigade stalled Heath's attack. To the west, John B. Gordon's division overlapped 2 brigades from Griffin's division.
So these are among the best Confederate division commanders, at least the most experienced that you can have right at this point. They're not always perfect and they don't always perform admirably, but Henry Heath, Robert Rhodes, and John Gordon, all incredible amounts of experience. Heath and Rhodes had led divisions at Gettysburg. Gordon has been an exemplary brigade commander up to this point and now commanding a division of his own.
Despite the darkness beginning to cover the field, Gordon pressed his men, who sent Griffin's men, running toward the Bethesda Church. Fortunately for the Union, artillery covered the area around the church and the Tinsley House. In the words of one Union soldier, the whole thing was miserably mismanaged. Robert E. Lee moved most of A.P. Hill's corps to the Confederate right when he saw Ulysses S. Grant move Winfield Scott Hancock's corps. Along with Hill's troops came soldiers commanded by former Vice President of the United States, John C. Breckinridge.
Yeah, so Breckinridge, up until this point, hasn't seen a lot of action in the Eastern Theater, but we're going to see him now more often, and he's also going to fight in the Shenandoah Valley.
Breckinridge spent most of the war in the Western Theater, but came east and was now operating in the Army of Northern Virginia, starting with the Battle of North Anna. Grant planned for an early morning attack to take place on June 3rd. Hancock's corps would make the attack at 4:30 a.m. The 2nd Corps commander organized his 3 divisions for the assault, with Francis Barlow and John Gibbon's divisions in front and David Birney's division in support.
And these are all experienced division commanders. I mean, you're talking about John Gibbon, who was commander of the Iron Brigade when it earned that nickname. He performed well pretty much everywhere. You've got Francis Barlow, who was wounded at Gettysburg, didn't perform particularly well there, so kind of a mixed bag with him. But this is where we're going to get into the part of Cold Harbor that most people know about, that famous charge that happens in the early morning and just results in horrendous casualties in minutes.
A light rain dropped on the Federal soldiers, similar to their attack on the Muleshoe on the Spotsylvania battlefield less than a month earlier. They would face 4 Confederate divisions. Troops under Robert Hoke, John C. Breckinridge, and Cadmus Wilcox made up the front line, while William Mahone's division remained in reserve. It was a strong line, and those rebel divisions had 12 hours to improve their positions by throwing up breastworks and digging in. At 4:30 a.m., a single gun broke the silence of the morning. The shot rang out from a cannon of the 10th Massachusetts Artillery. That was the signal for the Union soldiers to advance. They moved across the open ground in front of the rebel works. All
right, so I'm going to pause right here because I've been promising you an announcement. So you see here you have Brooks Brigade there, and that includes the 148th Pennsylvania. My next book, don't have a title for it yet, but my next book is going to cover Company B of the 148th Pennsylvania. The company was raised by a first cousin, like 5 times removed of mine. He was a nephew of one of my ancestors, and quite a few of the men in that regiment are related to me, and a bunch of them are also related to my ex-wife. So my kids are related to like half the 148th Pennsylvania, raised mostly in Center County in the area around State College where Penn State University is today. So the plan is that will be released sometime next year. So there you go. I made the announcement for our patrons a couple of weeks ago, but now the rest of you have it.
Artillerymen remembered the assault as simply terrific. It had the fury of the Wilderness musketry with the thunders of the Gettysburg artillery superadded. The men in John Eccles' brigade were in a muddy mess within their breastworks, and the rain only made it worse, so their commander pulled them back a little distance to get to some higher ground. But this exposed a weak point in the Confederate line, just as the massive Union assault was taking place. The 7th New York Heavy Artillery, now turned infantry, took the initiative and pushed back Eccles' brigade. The rest of John Brooks' brigade was behind them, but the withering fire from the Confederate muskets forced many of them to lie down in a ditch. But the 5th New Hampshire continued on and wheeled into the opening created by Eccles' retreat.
So you see the 5th New Hampshire come flying in there, right? And it's like, kind of a Leroy Jenkins kind of thing. 5th New Hampshire, of all of the 2,000 or so regiments in the entire Union Army throughout the course of the American Civil War, the 5th New Hampshire will take more battle deaths than any other regiment. 5th New Hampshire, 148th PA, and others are units that were fighting in places like the wheat field at Gettysburg. That's where they have a very unique monument there, which is on a giant boulder, and the 5th New Hampshire monument is on top of that, and it was chosen for a very specific reason because that's where the 5th New Hampshire's commanding officer, who was actually commanding the brigade that day, was mortally wounded during the fighting in the wheat field.
When they entered the works, the Confederates on either side of them began peppering their flanks with rifle fire, causing great disorder. William Mahone's division sat in reserve, and when the breakthrough took place, Mahone sent Joseph Finnegan's brigade of Floridians and the 2nd Maryland Battalion from Breckinridge's division into the breach.
And this is the problem when you have a breakthrough, but you've got that whole reserve line. You can plug those gaps. You can throw those men back.
The New Yorkers and men from New Hampshire had no choice but to leave the Confederate entrenchments, knowing that they couldn't survive alone without support. A soldier from the Granite State remembered, "I found the enemy had a second line, and as my losses up to this time had been very light, I moved up to attack the second line, and then ascertained that the other regiments of the brigade had not carried the enemy's works."
There's no worse feeling, and this happens in every war, than being successful in your sector in doing your job, but seeing that the supporting units on either side or the reinforcements that are supposed to come up behind you have not been successful, whether it's through any fault of their own or not, but that forces you to give up your success despite having achieved what you felt like was a great victory.
Brigade, which went over on our right, was obliged to retire, and the 5th Regiment was between the enemy's lines with no connection on either flank, and immediately ascertaining that no supports were in sight, gave the order to withdraw. After the repulse of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery, John Gibbon's division moved forward. They were delayed because Joshua Owen, one of Gibbon's troublesome brigade commanders, was nowhere to be found, including the brigade of soldiers.
See, this is what I'm talking about the lack of coordination and just the ground level logistic issues. These are not things that are on Grant. It's not his responsibility to make sure that your brigade commander shows up. You have to have that stuff figured out at the corps level and at the division level.
They were all still asleep, so this delayed the attack about 15 minutes, precious minutes to the troops on their left.
Yeah.
The ground over which Gibbon's men moved hadn't been reconnoitered. In fact, none of the ground had been reconnoitered in the Second Corps' front.
And this is another major issue. They hadn't properly scouted the ground. There's just so many problems with this attack that shouldn't have happened. These are unforced errors, as you would say in tennis.
This was a mistake and a blemish on Hancock's record.
Yeah.
Part of David Russell's division of the Sixth Corps lay in Gibbon's way. Gibbon's 2 brigades moved closer to the Confederate line, and the 8th New York Heavy Artillery approached the Confederate position and received devastating volleys from Hoke's troops. One soldier in Penrose's brigade remembered, "These men were in bright new uniforms and went into the fight with their knapsacks on. It was the most sickening sight of the war." Penrose and Cross were supposed to advance with Tyler, but when they saw the slaughter of the heavy artillery, they remained where they were and dug in.
When you go to the Cold Harbor National Cemetery today, you'll see just so many of these men who died were from these heavy artillery regiments. These are guys who are just seeing combat for the first time in the war, most of them during this campaign, and it's just horrific.
Hugged the ground and began to dig in, unable to move for the next 16 hours. Smith's brigade didn't fare any better. Once the musketry began to rip through their ranks, they hugged the ground too and began to entrench, piling any amount of dirt possible to conceal themselves. Joshua Owen and Henry McKean's brigades were ordered in, but the artillery and musketry was too destructive, and they advanced a little ways and then began to dig in. Hancock's men had advanced into the open fields to attack the Confederate works and been met with destruction. To the north, Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps was to attack around the same time as Hancock. Parts of the brigades and divisions moved forward, but the artillery and rifle fire became too much for them. Some men had been so badly bloodied from the fight on June 1st that they simply remained in their hastily made entrenchments. A soldier who did advance toward the rebel works remembered, "We never even reached the enemy's works. We advanced under a murderous fire in our front from the enemy's artillery and sharpshooters when in range of its main line of battle, and were simply slaughtered."
When you start reading this stuff and you start thinking about what happened here, it's no doubt that of the places I've been in the United States, one of the heaviest historic sites I've ever felt in terms of, you know what I mean? If you've ever been somewhere and just felt the weight of what happened there and just felt the oppressive, there's just something that you can't really explain. Cold Harbor, and in particular, there's not much of the Cold Harbor battlefield that's preserved today, but some of this area that we're talking about in this fight here is preserved, and I'm not sure I've felt that any worse than I have in that place, at least not here in the United States.
The sporadic and uncoordinated movements of the Sixth Corps produced no results, and most of the men withdrew to safety. The half-hearted attempts at attacking the Confederate works didn't relieve pressure on Hancock's troops, and it didn't inspire confidence in William Baldy Smith's 18th Corps, which was also attacking the Confederate works, right alongside the 6th and 2nd Corps. 3 of Smith's brigades stepped off in an assault, but were quickly either pinned down or thinned so badly that the units couldn't make any kind of stand against the rebels.
So one of the things I like that he does is he zooms out and he's showing us the entire battlefield, but then we get those zoomed in focuses on particular areas, and I think that's so important in understanding this, is that we do both.
The man remembered, in less than 10 minutes from the word forward, there was no brigade to be seen, and of its leading regiment, nearly one half lay dead or disabled on the field, while the remaining scattered ones, 2 at least out of every 10, were more or less severely wounded. Guy Henry's brigade attacked as the others were falling back, but once he saw the desperate situation, the attack ground to a halt, and the men either ran back to their lines or laid on the ground searching for cover.
Yeah, so these guys have seen what has gone before them and what has happened, and who wants to have that same thing happen to you?
Soon word came to Meade that the attacks had stalled out, and the men were digging in rather than attacking. At 7 a.m., Meade sought the advice of Grant. Grant responded, "The moment it becomes certain an assault cannot succeed, suspend the offensive. But when one does succeed, push it vigorously,
Yes.
and if necessary, pile in troops at that successful point from wherever they can be taken." On the north end of the Union line, Burnside launched a small attack of his own, but the attack fizzled out when the Confederate line in that sector appeared too strong. Back on Hancock's front, Finnegan's Floridians and James Martin's North Carolinians were uneasy with the Federal troops dug in so close to their lines and wanted to send them back.
Yeah, if you go there today and you look at the lines, they're not that far apart. I mean, we're talking about a couple hundred yards at most.
So they launched a counterattack on the evening of June 3rd. Both brigades were riddled with bullets as they attempted to confront the Federal soldiers, who were unwilling to give up the ground so easily. The rebels fell back to their entrenchments.
And I'm guessing these particular ones are even closer than that. I'd have to look at a map, but I think the main line here is maybe a couple hundred yards.
Short time on the morning of June 3rd, 3,500 Union soldiers fell in the disastrous assaults.
And it's important to note that though we've focused so heavily on this June 3rd attack, and that's mostly what people think of when they think of Cold Harbor, this is a battle that lasted the better part of 2 weeks. It wasn't just that morning.
Meade sought input from his corps commanders about another possible offensive. Hancock responded, "I am averse to an assault, simply because my men have been so constantly out at the front, lying in the trenches all the time for 3 days, and are so fatigued that I fear they have not the dash necessary to carry through the obstacles of a second line."
This is wise. I mean, Hancock has not done well in all of this, but he's right. He's absolutely right, and this is a corps commander standing up for his men and telling the Army commander what he needs to hear in that moment.
They have lost the officers who have been accustomed to lead them, and the obstacles are materially greater than they were on the first day. Other small attacks would occur, but nothing substantial after the massive assaults on June 3rd. The Union lost 12,737 total, 1,844 killed, 9,077 wounded, and 1,816 missing and captured. The Confederacy lost 4,595, 83 killed, 3,380 wounded, and 1,132 missing and captured.
All right, I had to stop and look because I think he just made a typo there. The Confederates lose around 800 killed in this battle. One number I read said 788, so I don't know if he meant to say 783 or 830, because some of these other numbers are a little off of the ones that I read, but there's different numbers. It's all fluid because depending on who was reporting at any given time and depending on what numbers you read, so I'm not going to criticize him for that. But that's clearly a typo there. There were not only 83 killed, about 10 times that many.
A Union surgeon described the Overland Campaign as, "It has been fight, fight, fight. Every day there is a fight, and every day the hospital is again filled." 2 more cavalry battles would mark the Overland Campaign, the Battle of Trevelyan Station and the Battle of St. Mary's Church. Both of them produced results for the Union and the Confederacy. At Trevelyan Station, Philip Sheridan was able to destroy some of the Virginia Central Railroad, but Wade Hampton inflicted more casualties on the Union Cavalier and halted the raid. At St. Mary's Church, Confederate cavalry outnumbered their Union counterpart guarding the wagon train, but was unable to destroy the supplies. With the end of those 2 battles, the Overland Campaign came to an end. Lee had countered every move that Grant made, but Grant kept maneuvering his army toward Richmond. By Cold Harbor, he was incredibly close to the capital. From the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse to North Anna and Cold Harbor, both armies suffered immense casualties and left bodies strewn across the Virginia countryside.
So say what you want about Grant being, I said this earlier, about being a butcher that was hurling his men at these lines, but he's fighting a war of maneuver. He's constantly maneuvering to try and get around Lee's right. And that's kind of why you see this sidestepping going on from battle to battle. And eventually he's going to settle in on trying to get at Petersburg and come at Richmond from the south. He's right there at Cold Harbor. He could have kept, if he was really that butcher that was just hurling men and material, he could have just kept throwing men at Cold Harbor until Lee ran out of men and marched into Richmond, but he's not doing that. And he very nearly does get around Lee in the aftermath of this as he's trying to get toward Petersburg, but then they settle in for the siege.
The numbers vary from historian to historian, but Gordon Ray, in his book In the Footsteps of Grant and Lee, estimates that Grant lost 55,000 men, or 45% of his army, and Lee lost about 33,000 troops, or 50% of his army during the Overland Campaign. Total, nearly 90,000 men became casualties of war in a little over a month's time.
Right. And see, this is the thing that we have to consider with what I said earlier, right? Gettysburg, 51,000 casualties, but from Chancellorsville in late April, early May, until the next spring, really, you don't have any other major battles that happened in the East. You have skirmishes and smaller fights, but you don't have any major battles. And so Gettysburg's 51,000 casualties, Chancellorsville's casualties, these are heavy, but they're isolated and spread out over months of action. This is a month of action with nearly 90,000 casualties. No single battle in this campaign is greater than Gettysburg, but combined, this is way worse. It really is. I mean, we can't understate just how horrific the casualties were in the Overland Campaign on both sides.
This demonstrates two things: Lee's tactical ability to counter a superior force, and Grant's tenacity to push Lee to his limits. Previous to Grant, the other Union commanders were too timid to take on Lee, but through this bloody trial, Grant found out that Lee was not like the Confederate commanders that he had dealt with in the West. After Cold Harbor, during Grant's next phase, the Army of the Potomac would cross the James River and strike for Petersburg and lay siege to that city and Richmond.
All right, great job as always with that channel. He does a fantastic job of really helping us to visualize these things. So please consider checking him out if you're into the Civil War, and subscribe and watch some of his other content. It's fantastic. I want to thank Kelsey Mackey and Nate Perry for your support on Patreon. And I also want to invite you guys to check out my podcast, Stories of the Civil War. We are in the middle of an Overland Campaign podcast series. I already released a video about the Wilderness. The one about Spotsylvania Courthouse will be coming later this week. So check that out wherever you get your podcasts on whatever platform. Thanks for watching.